So, I was playing around with Chatgpt again, and I was thinking of the Soviet Union, again, like I always do, the freak that I am. And it dawned on me how it wasn't really even that long ago when this empire was a superpower, threatening Europe and Asia, stockpiling nuclear weapons, sending people into outer space, and covering a sixth of the Earth's surface. Of course, we have a lot of that in its successor now in Russia, but let's not go down that path. I was wondering about what would happen if the Soviet Union still existed in 2023, and how it could have been preserved if so. Being a filthy millennial and not wanting to do any serious thinking work for myself, I asked my boy ChatGPT if they could come up with a few different reasons of how the Soviet Union could have been preserved in the current day and age. And I'm going to rank all the reasons that it gave me, just like my last ChatGPT video. I hope you boys enjoy, so strap in, grab some popcorn, and let's get to it. We all know that the Soviet Union was a military and economic powerhouse that, in its heyday after the end of World War II and throughout the Cold War, rivaled the US and the West and provided a stark political and economic contrast to the capitalist democracies of the time. It had just come off defeating the largest invasion force in the history of war with Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, and had now occupied and installed puppet governments in Eastern Europe and possessed significant political and military influence in diplomatic circles. It all collapsed in 1991 under increasing economic and political pressure, both from internal and external opposition. If it hadn't gone this way and existed until the modern day though, what reforms could have been put in place to retain the Soviet Union, and what could we expect to see as a result of this? First up, we have the economic reforms point, and ChatGPT says that the Soviet Union could have seriously reformed their economy and embraced what China ended up doing in the late 20th century, which ended up having significant economic development and raising the standard of living for their average citizens. We all know that the Soviet economy was, well, a bit bad, particularly because they'd been spending so much on weapons to match with the US, and I suppose we're all familiar with the bread lines and the rationing because there were some things that were in excess that no one wanted, and the most desired consumer goods were in short supply or hard to obtain. Gorbachev actually wanted to reform the economics of the Soviet Union, which were attempted through his perestroika policy, although this had the opposite effect of reforming its economics and ultimately contributed to the Soviet Union collapsing altogether because of the greater freedoms that were given to the people of the USSR and Eastern Europe. ChatGPT uses China as an example of market-oriented reform working in a communist state, although if we look at China today, it's debatable if China is considered to be a communist country, a state capitalist country, or a mixture of both. Overall though, I like this point. I'm gonna give this a solid 7 out of 10. So next up is the political reforms point. Now ChatGPT suggests that the political reforms within the Soviet Union could have created greater political openness and democratization within the USSR. It says that these changes may have increased public faith within their political system. This is a bit of a tough one though. On one hand, it is undeniable that people within the USSR and Eastern Bloc countries craved the individualistic freedoms that came with democracies in the West. On the other hand, enabling freedoms to individuals in a collective society that is subservient to a dictator or authoritative figure is a recipe for disaster. The 100 Flowers campaign in China comes to mind, where Mao supported criticism within the party and then punished those that had criticized the party subsequently. I'm not sure if there's ever been a successful example in history where a state that was authoritarian introduced political reforms without the entire system collapsing or the dictator in question relinquishing their power. If anyone has any that come to mind, let me know in the comment section. A commendable suggestion though, so I give this a 5.5. The third point that ChatGPT suggests is that nationalism and ethnic relations could have been improved and that ethnic conflicts could have been reduced if it had gone a different way. To be honest, I think that if ethnic tensions were engulfing the Soviet Union, then it was probably already on its way out. This kind of ties back to economics for me. If a country is wealthier on average or has a higher standard of living, then its citizens tend to not point fingers at other ethnicities living within, as everyone is relatively affluent or poor. Certain policies that were introduced by leaders like Stalin, like deporting minorities to the other side of the USSR, didn't help with ethnic tension. This included Koreans, Greeks, Germans, Poles, Armenians, Turks, and others usually being deported to Central Asia. Yes, there were probably some tension between ethnic groups in the USSR, but what country that has had many different ethnic groups has not endured some form of strain? Okay, maybe a little bit too soon. I give this a 6.5 out of 10. So the next suggestion by Chatgpt is pretty solid. I think this is actually one of the better ones. Poor relations with the US meant that the USSR was constantly trying to militarize and spend money on maintaining a large standing military, which made their domestic economy not as efficient due to resources being rediverted to their military rather than at home. Realistically speaking, the USSR was never able to take on the West or NATO and was clearly the secondary power when it came to the Cold War. I'm not saying that the Soviet Union should have disarmed entirely, and that they were never going to anyway. They never wanted to get caught with their pants down again like World War II, but improving relations with the West, like China did with Nixon in the 1970s, could have seriously prevented the USSR from collapsing altogether by 1991. I give this point a solid 7 out of 10. So the next point is leadership stability, and ChatGPT suggests that Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko were all leaders that had relatively little time in government. All were older, and all were gone or replaced subsequently. This is an issue, particularly when we're talking about a superpower, a government that is meant to project strength and power on a global scale. I believe that if the Soviet Union had a figure that was younger, more popular, and able to steer away from older policies that were enforced by the older Soviet leadership, then the USSR had a very real chance of surviving. I'm not talking about Gorbachev either, someone younger. In an alternate timeline, a Soviet JFK could have realistically saved the USSR from collapsing entirely. Countries that have leaders which are favourable tend to not implode on themselves. Tito comes to mind as a leader which kept a country going despite various tensions within the country. This is a decent point though, so I give it a 6.5. So the next point is economic diversification. So like the first point of economic reforms, the USSR could have stepped away from oil and gas revenue, similar to how Russia is today as a petrol state, and diversified their economy so that they weren't so reliant on these two exports alone. The USSR had a highly literate and educated workforce, and they could have easily become a more service-based economy, or one that was much less dependent on the global economy and more self-reliant. I want to give this one a solid 6 out of 10 just because it just ties in too much to the first point. So the next point is media and information. Now while I agree that the USSR could have been more liberal in parts, how could an authoritarian state have allowed more individual freedoms without collapsing entirely? It's the same issue as the political reforms point in the Soviet Union. Even today, we see China as a state that while wealthier than its 20th century self, it's still a bit politically repressive. That's fine. ChatGPT mentions the reductions of ideological rigidity, which would make more people view the other side, aka Western countries and non-communist ones, but I'm not sure if that would help the USSR, unless it already had living conditions that were on par with those in the West. Otherwise, I feel like you'd have a lot more defections and general unrest. I feel like if you were to give people more individualistic freedoms, then it would just accelerate the collapse of the USSR. So I'm not really sure if I'm feeling this one, maybe a 4 out of 10. So the next point that ChatGPT suggests is the improvement of social services in the USSR, as it could have improved the people's ultimate satisfaction with the system. This is a great point because I think it's the first point before a lot of these other ones can come to fruition, like political reform and allowing media and information to become more available to the average Soviet citizen. If the average quality of life improves in the USSR, and they have the resources available to do so if they reduce their military spending, then they would be able to compete with the West, at least in quality of living standards, and enable more people to have faith in their system. This needs to come before people can go to Western countries and see how much better they have it there, otherwise people lose faith in the Soviet system, which is something that happened in the end. I think this is a solid 6.5 out of 10. So the next point is the de-escalation of the arms race. Now this ties into a lot of the economic mismanagement that the USSR was notorious for. It was spending way too much on military when it didn't need to, and then its invasion of Afghanistan probably made it even more susceptible to economic drain. Their internal economic policy should have focused on making the living standards of the USSR more competent by maybe introducing economic reforms that are similar to today's China, as the standard of living was beginning to stagnate, and allocating more money towards nuclear weapons would have made it only worse. I mean, they ended up having more nukes than the US, which is actually ridiculous when you think about it. The Warsaw Pact also heavily drained resources when it was trying to compete with NATO, and when you look at the supposed numbers, they were always outnumbering the US with an economy that was nowhere near as strong. It is a good idea, so I give this one a solid 7.5 out of 10. And the final point is addressing corruption. As in every country, corruption did also exist in the USSR. According to a report by the US Department of Justice, the USSR had corruption organized by people for their own private gain, and it was prevalent as people needed to bribe so that they could also obtain goods or services that were not readily available. These economic crimes converted to the housing sector and institutions of education, where officials, using their influence and power, would also allow themselves or someone closely related to them to have preference over others. Likewise, the USSR also had bureaucratic corruption, a common example of which included people falsely reporting data so that they could meet desired quotas. This is a more tough one to curb, as I believe that corruption reduction would have made the life of citizens attain a higher standard of living, but I really have no idea how to prevent corruption, particularly in a communist country where people naturally crave individualism because it is so suppressed. Greater transparency in government could have also been achieved, but realistically I have no idea how the Soviet leadership could have done this. It's a decent point, I'm just not really sure about the feasibility of it all. So I give it a 6.5 out of 10. Not bad. Overall, boys, the final mark was a 63 out of 100. Decently solid, better than what I was doing in high school for sure. But what were some of the key differences that happens if the Soviet Union exists until the present day? It's really hard to say. I think the world would be divided into a tripolar world, as the USSR and China also weren't really seeing eye to eye during the Cold War anyway, with the whole Sino-Soviet split thing. Anyway, the US, Soviet Union and China would all be playing off each other, trying to one-up the other and gang up on the third power. Unless the economics of the Soviet Union though did not improve drastically, there would be continued defections and brain drain to Western countries, both through legal and illegal methods. Germany would still be divided, as would North and South Korea. Not that that specifically changes anyway. Countries like Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia probably would still exist, and I think a global competition would persist between the US, which leads the Western and democratic world, and China and the USSR, which leads the state capitalist or market reform model, as maintaining the state-run model was really showing inefficiencies by the late 1980s. So, overall, would the Soviet Union have survived if it had listened to a chatbot from 2022? It's hard to really say. Do I agree with the Soviet Union's politics and economics? Absolutely not. But I think a lot of the points were valid, and if the USSR had the ability to reform economically and politically, it could have seen serious improvement in living standards and continued to thrive today, much like today's China. Although it is debatable as to whether this would be counted as communist or socialist, in the sense that the original principles of communism under Marxist-Leninism would be more or less modified to suit the direction of the country. Similarly, is China a communist state in this current era? That's also very arguable. I think that the Soviet Union was a system which had some major flaws, but it still had a very impressive run during its heyday. That is not to say, however, that the Soviet Union could have not run smoother or more effectively, minus the repressive policies and the gulags. Anyway boys, I hope you enjoyed the video. It took me a while to make, so if you liked it, slap the like button, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace out.